We keep handing the crown to the wrong people, not because they're good, but because they're good at being seen. The world doesn't follow the wise, it follows the loud. We follow performers, not protectors. We trust certainty over humility, charisma over character, visibility over value. And so the ones who should lead often never do. And the ones who crave power, I almost always find it. This is the crisis we never name, and yet we feel it in our workplaces, in politics, in our homes. We sense when someone is holding the mic because they need to be heard, not because they have something worth saying. Carl Jung warned us that the ego seeks only to be seen, to stand out, to be praised. But the self, the deeper self, asks a different question entirely. Who needs me? We're taught to chase titles, platforms, promotions. We're told leadership is about being in charge, being followed, being right. But servant leadership flips all of that upside down. It doesn't begin with ambition. It begins with awareness. Simon Sinek called it leaders eat last. But the idea is far older than modern leadership books. It lives in the memory of the warrior who stayed behind, the parent who gave up their plate, the elder who kept watch while everyone else slept. They didn't do it for applause. They did it because someone had to. Real leadership isn't about rising. It's about staying steady when everything else falls apart, staying grounded when others get loud, staying present when there's nothing to gain. But today we mistake attention for authority. We reward ego because it's confident. We elevate those who demand to be followed and forget to honor those who quietly carry what no one else can. But here's the truth. When the storm hits, we don't look for the biggest personality. We look for the person who doesn't leave, the one who's still there, still steady, still carrying the weight even when no one's watching. Servant leadership begins where ego ends. It starts in the shadows, in the moments that feel thankless, in the choices no one sees, but everyone feels. This isn't about humility as branding. This is about leadership as sacrifice, about stepping into the fire not to be remembered, but because others need shelter. You want to lead. Don't chase the spotlight. Find the weight, pick it up, carry it for as long as you can. That's the beginning of leadership. And that's the first step from ego to archetype. He didn't want the job, he didn't ask for the title, and when it was over, he gave it back without being asked. Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, a Roman farmer, not a politician, not a career strategist, just a man who was called when everything else was falling apart. Rome was collapsing, its enemies at the gates, its people desperate for order, so they gave him absolute power, made him dictator, gave him command of the entire republic. He led, he won, he restored order in days. And then, while the people were still cheering, he stepped down. No press conference, no term extension, no monument. He walked away, back to his farm, back to the dirt, back to the life he had before the crown. That wasn't weakness. That was a man who knew the crown was a burden, not an identity. That servant leadership in its rarest form, power held loosely, responsibility carried without ego. A man who knew when to step up and, just as importantly, when to step aside. Now ask yourself, how many leaders today would do the same? How many cling to power not because they're needed, but because they're afraid of being ordinary again? Carl Jung said the part of ourselves we refuse to face becomes the thing that controls us. He called it the shadow. And the shadow in leadership is the tyrant, the one who started as a servant but forgot, the one who became addicted to being important, to being followed, to being the answer. And that's the moment when leadership turns into performance. Simon Sinek tells the story of the Marines, how officers eat last, not because it's policy, but because it's culture. Because the higher you rise, the deeper your responsibility. Cincinnatus understood that. He understood that the power he was given wasn't his to keep, it was his to carry, and then to lay down. That's the turning point. That's the fracture line between ego and archetype, between the leader who holds on and the leader who lets go. One leaves behind a legacy of control. The other leaves behind people who learned how to lead themselves. That's what this servant leader, though. They show up, they carry, they let go, and in doing so, they teach us that the crown isn't something you wear, it's something you protect until the moment comes to set it down and walk away. He still wears the same uniform, still walks into the room with the same posture, still delivers the same words with practiced precision. But something has changed. He feels it. and so does everyone else. Where once there was weight in his words, now there is caution. Where there was presence, now there is performance. He doesn't ask for feedback anymore. He avoids it. He doesn't inspire trust. He demands loyalty. He tells himself it's still about the mission, but deep down he knows it's become about staying in the chair. This is how it begins. Not with a throne, but with a flinch, a tightening, a subtle fear that if he lets go, he won't know who he is anymore. Carl Jung warned us that what we fail to face within becomes our fate. The part of us we exile, the shame, the insecurity, the fear of being ordinary, it doesn't disappear, it waits, and in the darkness of unexamined power, it grows. Every leader carries a shadow, the desire to be needed, the fear of being forgotten, the hunger to matter so much that we forget what we're actually here to do. That shadow doesn't scream, it whispers, "You built this. You can't leave it now." They won't respect you if they see you hesitate. If you stop leading, you stop existing. And if you don't stop to look that voice in the eye, you will lead from it. You'll manipulate instead of guide, protect your status instead of your people. And tell yourself it's strategy, man, when it's really just fear with better branding. The tyrant doesn't begin as a monster. He begins as someone who was once afraid and chose image over integrity. And the worst part, it works for a while. People follow out of habit or fear. Well, because they think they have no other choice. But inside that leader's mind, the walls close in. He doesn't sleep anymore. He replays conversations at 2 a.m. He stares into the mirror and doesn't recognize the person reflected back. That mirror doesn't lie. And what it shows is terrifying because it reveals what leadership becomes when we serve the role more than we serve the people. So here's the question: what would you be if you couldn't lead? Would you still be whole? Still worthy, still yourself? Or have you let the crown define you so completely that you've forgotten who you were before it fit your head? Jung called the path back individuation, not a brand, not a style, but a reckoning. It's the painful, liberating process of becoming someone who doesn't need to be followed. To know they're leading well, it's when you stop reaching outward and start digging inward, and what you find there, beneath the armor and ambition, is someone who doesn't need to dominate, who doesn't need applause, who no longer fears surrender. The tyrant clings, but the servant lets go, and the servant, in letting go, becomes something more than a leader. They become a presence. They become safety. They become stillness in a room that's losing its mind. They become the person others want to follow, not because they have to, but because something in them says, if this is what leadership looks like, maybe the world isn't lost after all. That's the shift. That's the fracture line. That's where it begins, from ego to archetype. January 13th, 1982, Washington, D.C. Flight 90 lifts off and falls within seconds. The plane slams into the icy Potomac River, bodies in the water, wreckage everywhere. No time, no plan. Just survival. A helicopter arrives. A rope drops. A man grabs it. He could have pulled himself out. He could have saved himself first, but he doesn't. He passes it to the woman beside him. Then again, and again. 5 people, 5 lives. By the time they return for him, he's gone. His name was Arland D. Williams, Jr., a man with no title, no mandate, just one choice: save himself or save others. And 5 times he chose them. Not because it was heroic, but because the decision had already been made. Not in that moment, but in the kind of life he had already lived. That's the thing about crisis. It doesn't create character, it reveals it. It shows what's already been practiced in silence, the quiet generosity, the unseen sacrifices, the decisions to let someone else go first, over and over, until that instinct becomes who you are. That's what servant leadership looks like when it's stripped of theory. No philosophy, no platform, just water, ice, and a rope that keeps being passed. Because the servant doesn't ask, do I deserve to go first? They ask, who needs this more? And then they act. Without waiting to be thanked, without expecting to be remembered. But then there's Bhai Kinahir, 17th century Punjab, a battlefield soaked in blood. He walks through the carnage with a goat's skin of water, tending to the wounded, all the wounded. His side, the enemy, it doesn't matter. To him, there are no sides, only suffering. The soldiers drag him before Guru Gobind Singh, accusing him of treason. And when asked to explain himself, he says, I saw no enemy. I only saw human beings. That's not weakness, that's sight. The kind of sight ego cannot bear, the kind of sight the world has almost forgotten. Because ego sees sides, the servant sees souls. And the moment we stop measuring who's worthy and start tending to who's hurting, we step into something deeper. We stop being defenders of our tribe and start becoming caretakers of humanity. That's the work. Not always loud, not always clean, often thankless, always transformational. These are the leaders history doesn't headline. But humanity never forgets, because they are the ones who pass the rope, the ones who kneel beside the wounded, the ones who lead without needing a single person to follow them. And in doing so, they carry us forward when everything else is frozen. He never asked to be remembered. Nicholas Winton was 29, a stockbroker, a man with a train ticket and a ski trip planned in 1938. But something didn't sit right. A friend told him about Prague, about the refugee children trapped between rising danger and closing borders. So he changed his plans, boarded a train instead, and found himself face to face with desperation. There were no systems in place, no government stepping in, just fear. Children. Mothers begging strangers to take their babies. He could have left, he could have gone back to his normal life, but he didn't. He rented a hotel room, set up a desk, and began organizing. Trains, documents, foster families, visas, some legal, some forged, some improvised in panic. In a few short months, he rescued 669 children, got them to safety, saved their futures. Then he went home and said nothing. Not to the press, not to the public, not even to his wife. 50 years passed, until she found the old scrapbook, the names, the photos, the lists. And then came the day they brought him onto a television show, sat him in the front row, surrounded him with strangers, until they stood one by one and said, I was one of them. Children who had grown up, built lives, had children of their own, all because a man they didn't know chose to act and never needed to be known for it. That's not just humility, that's the absence of ego. That's a life moved by service, not self. Carl Jung spoke of the transformation from the ego to the self, the moment where your identity is no longer built on applause but on alignment, no longer driven by validation but by vocation. That's who Winton became. He didn't just change lives, he disappeared so others could live. And then was Maximilian Kolbe, a prisoner in Auschwitz, a priest, a man with no freedom, no weapon, no voice, but one thing no one could take, his choice. When a fellow prisoner was selected to die, the man broke. My wife, my children. Kolbe stepped forward. I will take his place. Silence fell, and in that silence, something holy happened. They threw him into a starvation bunker with 9 others. Days passed. He prayed with them, sang with them, held them as they died. When only he remained still alive, they injected him with poison. He didn't fight it, because the decision had already been made. That's what ego can't comprehend. But the self knows it by heart. To give without needing to be noticed, to step forward without being asked, to become the shelter someone else might survive under. Leadership at that level is no longer about influence, it's about presence. It's not about being followed, it's about being followed in the moment someone else is drowning. The world rarely sees these people in real time. It sees them in hindsight, in photographs, in names on plaques, in stories that sound too good to be true, until we realize they were simply good without needing to be seen. That is the blueprint of servant leadership, the courage to act, the wisdom to disappear, the humility to carry without claiming, because they weren't in it for recognition. They were in it to rebuild someone else's future. They didn't need legacy, they needed people to live, and they made that happen. Not with speeches, but with sacrifice, not with image, but with instinct, not with ego, but with the archetype already alive inside them, quietly waiting to be remembered in us. Leadership is not what you think it is. It's not charisma, it's not control, it's not being the loudest voice in the room, or the last person to speak. It's not about the position you hold, but the presence you bring. Carl Jung wrote that the self emerges when we shed the illusions of the ego, when we no longer need to be everything because we've become enough, quietly, completely, without applause. And that's where servant leadership is born, not at the top of the hierarchy, but at the bottom of the burden. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't need credit. It shows up, stays late, listens deeply, and lifts when no one is watching. You don't need a platform to lead, you don't need a rank, you don't need permission. You need presence, you need responsibility, you need a willingness to carry what others drop, because the servant leader isn't trying to be seen. They're trying to hold something together. And the paradox, those are the leaders we remember most, even when we forget their names, not because they made themselves visible, but because we felt safe when they were near. And maybe that's you. Maybe you've stayed late to carry someone else's weight. Maybe you've held space in silence. Maybe you've answered a call that no one else heard and you didn't tell anyone you did it. That matters. More than you know, you've already taken the steps from ego to archetype, from self-image to self-inaction, from chasing power to becoming it. This is what leadership looks like now. Not someone pointing forward, but someone kneeling beside the broken and saying, I'm not leaving. You won't see them in the headlines, but you'll feel their absence when they're gone. They are the glue, the gravity, the ones who keep the fire burning when everyone else is too tired to hold the match. And when the moment comes, they don't run, they don't posture, they don't reach for the crown, they carry it quietly, faithfully, and if necessary, alone. You don't have to be famous to lead, you don't have to be loud to be powerful, you just have to be the one who stays, the one who listens, the one who serves, because the world doesn't need another hero, it needs you as you already are, becoming what it forgot to honor. The crownless leader, the invisible strength, the servant who became power itself, not by claiming it, but by giving it all away.